Hi, this is Josh Bycer from GameWisdom.com. Hope you enjoyed this Critical Thought, a detailed discussion on game design, and be sure to subscribe and you can pitch future Critical Thought topics. Alright everybody, we got a quick Critical Thought for you today, even though I always like to say that. But I want to talk about the topic of cheap versus challenging difficulty. And I know we've certainly spoken about this one in the past, but recently we had a great conversation on one of our live shows, and I finally finished the Nioh Dragon of the North. I always get those two confused. Dragon of the North DLC, and it certainly hit that line between challenging and cheap game design. And whenever we have discussions about difficulty in games, it's always, no pun intended, tough to talk about, because everyone will view certain things differently. I'm sure for those of us who complain about Nioh's difficulty, there's probably someone who beat every boss at level 1 using the starter's sword and loves to say, get good. But trying to determine when something goes over that line between from being challenging to just plain unfair against the player is a difficult process. And I usually have a few criteria for myself about when that happens. And the big one that I like to think about is when the game breaks its own rules. What that means is, if you tell the player or you introduce to the player XYZ into your game design, and then have enemies who not only will ignore that, but are given an unfair advantage, then I kind of consider that to be a bit unfair. Now, there are some unusual or unique exceptions to this rule. For instance, in the Soul series, all the normal enemies in the game don't have any stamina, but of course player characters do. Now, this would be considered an unfair advantage, but the game accommodates or gives the player enough means to get around that, by the fact that the player is more reactive. You have more range capacities, more items to use, so it helps to compensate it. Likewise, if you're playing a game where, well, here's a really good example. A lot of roguelikes are basically designed against the player. You're going to be up against wave after wave of enemies. If you're playing one that's built on RPG progression, they could throw enemies at a higher level than you. Now, in this case, the design is meant to compensate the player by providing them with enough tricks and items to basically get around the enemy. And that is basically one of the main goals of any roguelike design. If the enemy does X, how do I get around that? But if your game is set up using a very specific set of rules, and then you change them either mid-play or introduce something that will ignore or invalidate it, that I think takes things over the line. And the Nioh DLC has certainly hit that point. If you didn't watch my video of it on the channel, the video, the rage-inducing Maria fight, is a good example, I think, when things go overboard. Now, in Nioh, there are two types of enemies. You have the demon or yokai, and then you have humanoid enemies. Humanoid enemies operate similar to the player, that they recover their ki, or Nioh's version of stamina. And the only way to basically stagger them or to weaken them is to keep putting the pressure on them so they can't recover ki, and then hit them when they're all out. And this basically lets you do a punishing attack and leaves them exposed, and likewise to the player. When you're fighting the yokai, they don't recover ki, but the only way to reduce it is just keep hitting them because they will not drain it otherwise. And then there are other little things as well. Most human enemies you can do a parry counter. You can actually stagger them if you hit them while they're comboing or in the back and stuff along those lines. And again, these are all ways of introducing different elements to the game while still providing the player with the means to get around it. If you're fighting against a yokai, you're not going to be able to parry their attacks, but you're going to have to rely on your agility and, again, hopefully just to beat them down to stagger them. If you're fighting against a human enemy, yes, they can block, but it is possible to stagger them or stun them and maneuver around to try and deliver that fatal blow. The Maria fight, however, basically throws all that out the window. Maria is a humanoid type enemy, obviously, but she operates at different rules compared to the other enemies in the game. Her special ability, or her living weapon in Nioh, basically stays on infinitely, as long as she doesn't run out of ki. Now, normally you would just wait for it to drain out, except not only does she get her living weapon, but she recovers ki while she's able to use it. So basically, she has infinite ki this way. And then you would think, well, maybe I can just get around and attack her. No, she cannot be staggered out of any. Well, I think like most of her attacks, she cannot be staggered out. I think there's one that stops her for a second, and then she goes right back to the combo. So what that means is if you start attacking her, she'll just immediately turn around or use one of her 3 to 4 hit combos and kills you. And there's no way to get around it. And when I was talking to James about this on the chat or on our cast the other night, we talked about how there are some enemies or some of the earlier fights. The Warrior of the West fight is one that a lot of people basically raged against. And it's with another humanoid enemy who, even though he runs out ki, he's still allowed to attack, which is something that the player can't do. When you're all out ki, you stop attacking. And I think these are examples of when the difficulty goes over that line. Because again, all the other enemies in the game operate under the same conditions. Even other bosses in Nioh can be either staggered if they're humanoid, or they will not recover stamina if they're a yokai or have that kind of special ability. But the Maria fight tends to take things over the top. It was obviously designed to be a hard fight for the end of the DLC, but I don't think it's a fair fight. And a really good counterexample of this would actually be in Bloodborne. Bloodborne, obviously, as one of the many, as a sole spiritual sequel, is a tough game to play. And it introduces, again, a very consistent set of rules and how the world operates. If you're fighting most enemies that are either the player's height or maybe a little bit higher, or taller, I should say, you're able to parry their attack with your gun and then set up for a punishing blow. If you're fighting a larger enemy, something that's like 2 times the player's height, a dragon, Amidala, Ludwig, stuff like that, then you can't parry those attacks or stagger them using your gun. And that's the point. It's supposed to be set up again to have different rules or different considerations when fighting different types of enemies. But the thing about Bloodborne is that this remains consistent from beginning to end. There are some bosses in the game that you can, if you're good enough, you can just stagger them to death. The second you see them attack, stagger with your gun, perform the punishing attack, and repeat. The 2 final bosses of the DLC actually can be staggered. Even the final boss of that DLC, if you can correctly time its attacks, you're able to stagger and perform counterattacks and can pretty much nullify a lot of his combos. But that's the point of why this works, is that the rules never change. You're not going to find a giant enemy that you're able to stagger with your gun. Likewise, you're not going to see an enemy that's the player's height that is unstaggerable. Now, it does get a little bit difficult in the post-content, but again, when we talk about post-content and the normal path, you have to be careful in terms of balance, and we could spend another 15 minutes talking about that, I think. But the idea is, if you build your world around a set of rules, then the world or the rules should remain consistent. It's like playing a game with someone who decides to change things halfway through because you're winning or you're beating them. If you tell me that, let's say, fire doesn't work on, I don't know, fire monsters, let's say, and then halfway through the game, you then change that and say, well, now fire works, and there's no explanation. Now, while that would be considered an advantage for the player, it's still breaking the consistency of the setup. Now, like I said, when it comes to deciding if something is either challenging or cheap, again, that line is very thin. One of the hallmarks of great game design is introducing enemies that are designed to specifically counter player strategy or player options. For instance, a good example that I like to go back to is from the Darkness 2. In the Darkness 2, the player basically draws power from the shadows or darkness, as the name implies. So what they do is about a quarter of the way through is start introducing enemies who carry spotlights or throw flashbangs, and this is basically a direct counter against the player. But it's not seen as being unfair because the player still has other options, and it's considered a way of basically flipping the script. Another good example would be a game like Duskers, who each enemy in the game is designed around a very specific pattern and specific rule set. And the enemies have unique abilities that the player's drones will never get. And again, it's more about you figuring out the way to get around this. And I think that's the key point. When I'm doing stuff like the Maria fight in Nioh, it's not about getting around. There's no trick to avoiding this. There's no way to supersede it. Basically, the game tells me this is how it's going to be, and you have to deal with it. And these kinds of fights, I find, tend to become very mechanical. It becomes about basically exploiting as much of a simple pattern as you can make, and it's not really about improvisation or you growing as a player. It reminds me kind of I'm trying to think of some older examples of games, but I've played games where, I know, something like 1001 Deaths or 1001 Spikes, if I remember that name right. That is the very brutally difficult game that was basically built on just you having to figure out each level while dealing with death traps. And my problem with the game was it didn't feel like I was trying to grow as a player. It just felt like I had to jump through enough hoops to beat that level, and then everything that I've done basically goes away because I'm not really learning, I'm just having to deal with what the game sets up. Usually in a really good game like the Soulsborne series, the player's mastery grows as time goes on, so that when you get to the end of a game like Bloodborne, it should be on the easier side because you've been training for so long and you know how things work. And as a very good example, Gehrman, who is the final boss of Bloodborne, is a very well-designed boss, because even though he is powerful and he's using his own unique weapon, he's not doing anything in terms of his basic mechanics that you as a player can't do. It's another hunter fight, and the hunter fights in Bloodborne are some of the high marks of the game because it's really about fighting someone with similar abilities. It's why playing Ninja Guy in Black, that fighting like Demon Ryu or the mirror fights were such a interesting point. Because here we have an enemy who has much of the same abilities that you do, and then it's about basically who's better at it. Some other examples would be like fighting Virgil in Devil May Cry 3. But with that said, we're going to wrap things up here. For those of you watching, when do you think a game crosses that line into cheap difficulty? And what do you think are some effective ways to avoid it? And also, can you think of any games where the difficulty is over the top, but it always remains fair? And of course, to make it harder on you, the Soulsborne series doesn't count. I've already mentioned that. So, with that said, thank you so much for watching today's Critical Thought. If you're new, be sure to like and subscribe, and come back daily for more great discussions on game design here, and on Game Wisdom, where we examine the art and science of games. So until then, have a great night. Thank you so much for watching this video. If you enjoyed it, be sure to like and subscribe to the channel, and of course share with your friends. It always helps out. For daily posts on all manner of game design and industry topics, check out game-wisdom.com. To support the site and everything that I do, be sure to check out the Patreon campaign. If we can hit goals, it will mean more content for everyone to enjoy, and I'll be able to support myself and my household. If you want to follow me, you can find me on Twitter at GWBycer for updates throughout the day and random thoughts from me. And lastly, you can find me on Twitch right over there at GWBycer for daily streams most nights around 10 Eastern. Thanks again for watching the video, and be sure to check out more great content coming to the Game Wisdom channel real soon.